Welcome to the Learner Centered Collaborative Podcast. I am your host, Katie Martin, and today I'm here with my good friend, George Couros. George is a worldwide leader in the area of innovative teaching, learning, and leading, and has a focus on innovation as a human endeavor. Most importantly, he is a proud father and husband. His belief that meaningful change happens when you first connect to people's hearts is modeled in his writing and speaking. In his 20 plus years in the field of education, he has worked at all levels of school from K-12 as a teacher, technology facilitator, and school and district administrator. And he's currently an adjunct instructor with the Graduate School of Education at the University of Pennsylvania. George is also the author of the books, The Innovator's Mindset, Empower Learning, Unleash Talent, and Lead a Culture of Creativity, Innovate Inside the Box, and Because of a Teacher, and most recently, What Makes a Great Principal. Welcome, George.
Hey, it is awesome to have you. And I really appreciate, first of all, Innovator's Mindset, What Makes a Great Principal. For everyone listening, Katie actually, I trust Katie with everything I do educationally. So I said, can you just look this over, give me some feedback? And then she sent me all these revisions. I'm like, no, clean it up. I trust you because I hate editing stuff. So the success of any of these books or lack of success, right?
So far, Innovator's Mindset's been, I've had a good track run on that one.
Done well, yeah. So, but I, when I worked on this with Allyson, I said, I have to have Katie look this over. So I will tell you, after you had it, I was very proud of it when we first had it, and then we gave it to you. And then I was like, what is she doing? What is this magic that you do? So and you're acknowledged in this book for your incredible eye that I trust more, because I just love how you think about education. So, and Allyson, by the way, Allyson should be here right now. And I feel bad that she's not, but she's having her 25th anniversary with her husband. So, I didn't want to say hey, can you jump on a podcast? So so make sure Allyson, gets kudos for this book coming out, because she is obviously huge, my partner in this process as well.
Yeah, we'll have Allyson on later. I know she's like, I'm in Hawaii with my husband. I was like, that's okay. Enjoy that. We'll talk later.
She totally would have done it. And I know, and that's why I didn't ask her.
I know, it's good for everybody.
Yeah.
All right. So since you've been on the podcast before, you were the first guest, which of course was amazing. I want to switch up the first question that I generally ask. And instead of kind of what made you the leader you are today, I want to really dive into what made you want to write this book, What Makes a Great Principal?
Well, the thing I think goes back to Because of a Teacher. When I first came up with that concept, it wasn't actually a book, it was a podcast. And it was, I don't know if you remember this. I'm sure, people listening to this right now, in 2020, when everybody loved teachers for about 3 seconds, remember that? And it was like, teachers are the greatest thing ever. And then it was just animosity. And I was like, I want to do something to really appreciate, because I've had so many great teachers in my life, and I know so many people have, and too often we don't hear those things. So I started a podcast, and it was, I asked these questions: who's a teacher that inspired you? Who's an administrator that inspired you? And what advice did you give to your first year teacher self? And that actually turned into Because of a Teacher. And so there was always kind of a plan to create a principal version of this book. And then Allyson and I kind of talked about it, because she had just left the role of principal, and now she's, working with schools all over North America. And when it first came to the idea, I was like, yeah, I'm not ready. So something's missing. And then I read her book, Leading the Whole Teacher. And so I was like, this makes sense now. So it took me about a year to kind of come up to the concept. And it was because of reading Allyson's work. So Because of a Teacher is really, kind of chicken soup-ish, great stories of teachers, great stories of administrators. This one has some of that, but it also has some leading the whole teacher. So it's like, hey, what really matters to leadership? What really matters to the principalship? And what's the research behind it? And why does that matter? But then also getting stories from not only principals who served in the role and really kind of how they met those pillars, but teachers and students who have benefited. So a lot of times we say hey, here's what makes a great principal. And it's kind of from a top-down view, as opposed to who do they serve. And so I think that was what really, really mattered in this. So it's kind of like, Because of a Teacher with, some of the stories, but Leading the Whole Teacher, where it's like, hey, why does this matter? What's the research behind it? And then let's tell the stories. And I think the reason that's really important to me is because you can have all the research that you want, but if it's hard to get through, nobody reads it. And, or I guess no, but like not many people.
Some people read it, but
Some
it
people
rarely makes it to the schools and the classrooms.
Right. And then, but I think, that's why we wanted the story element of kind of combining the two. So it turned out, and again, kudos to I don't know what you did in your prior life that you are so good at this, but yeah, you just really did an amazing job cutting out parts and, tightening up parts before we even go to an editor. Right. So you just did a masterful job in kind of guiding us through that process. And so I really,
Well,
really appreciate that.
thank you. But it's also kudos in part to the topics that you're writing about really resonate with me. And so, I told you when I first read it, I'm like, oh, I love this. We have to add this. Seeing in the field the impact that principals do make, I think I really wanted this book to be amazing and really reflect a lot of what I see too. And we'll talk about the 5 pillars, but I want to just highlight that teachers, of course, are so critical to the success of students, right?
Right.
We know the research on the impact of a teacher, but we often see that in pockets in schools, in districts,
Right.
and you can have a great superintendent, but a great principal really can take a school from pockets of ideas and innovation and excellence to really create systems and a culture where there's amazing things happening for all kids. And we often overlook, I hear like principals as middle managers, like it's the bad thing that we just got to pass stuff through them. And when principals are really treated as the leaders that they are of those buildings and those
Right.
spaces, really great things happen for kids and communities.
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons. And you look at all the stuff that's going on in education right now, people leaving in droves, kind of leaving their profession. I always kind of put a little asterisk on the statement. I believe the principal is probably the most important role in education, in the sense that if you have a bad principal, it is very noticeable. And that's why a lot of teachers are leaving. And a lot of times when you have a great principal, it's not as noticeable. And I actually use the analogy of reffing. Really great refs, you don't notice them. But they're very, consequential to the flow of the game, getting the best of the players. But if you're a bad ref, that's when you notice people, right? You don't notice like, oh, that ref's really, really great. It's actually when you don't notice them, it is really, really important. And so I know you use the term middle managers. I think the reasoning why is because I think principals have the most authority closest to children. So let's say you're really good with communities and with families and you got some charm and stuff like that. Then you kind of get away with some stuff that's not great. And, and then people don't really pay attention to you because there's no phone calls going to central office. And, like there's a lot of, my principal lets me do anything. And it's like, well, that's not necessarily a great principal. Right. And so there's that vision. So I think it's not because the teacher is not hugely important. It's actually because the teacher is hugely important that principals matter so much. Because if you're a great teacher with a bad principal, you will either become a bad teacher or you will leave.
Or you'll leave because you're so frustrated. And that's exactly it. It's the culture and creates the space for everyone to be great. And the expectation, I think what you said is really important. He lets me do whatever I want, or she lets me do whatever I want, is not necessarily great, right? I often think, if as educators, as professionals, it's not doing whatever we want. Right. It's really collectively achieving the goals that are set out in ways that make sense for your community.
Yeah, and I think we all need, there's one part of the book. I don't know if you remember the conversation, like you and I kind of went back and forth about the visionary process. Do you remember that? Because you're like, why don't you define the vision? I'm like, that's not for me to decide, right? And so it's not that, even through the conversation, you made me think a little bit different. I think I made you think a little bit different in what I was trying to achieve. And I think part of that too is I guess if you would have if I would have just shown it to you and you just said, great, I wouldn't have asked you. Right. I needed, I think, so it's not like, oh, I'm going to do whatever I want. I know so many teachers who have left because they craved mentorship. They've craved they know that someone can help them become better, which is why I said, hey, Katie, I need you on this because I know you will. It wasn't just like, hey, I know I trust your editing, but I knew if there's like, I don't get what you're doing here. And then you would push me and then make me think and go, oh, you know what, I totally screwed that up, or I need to say it this way, or I was wrong. And I think that I think even through that process, like that's when people want to achieve greatness, there's usually someone that's they can go to that pushes them to be better.
Right. Instead of, I 100% agree. And that's why I appreciate conversations with you is it's not like, I'm just going to give you this, oh, it looks great. Nice job. That
No,
just feels like you didn't really take the time. Of course, there's always something that can improve. And being able to give that critical feedback is a sign that like, oh, you care about my work. You care about the
oh,
broader goal. And that's it important, right? As in principles and all the work we do.
well, and I don't even know if you really know this, but like the Impress books, like a publishing company that I co-own with myself and Dave Burgess, is there's a model that really is based on you in the sense that we have an editor that like goes through grammar and all that other stuff,
Mhm.
but we have like Paige, my wife, actually looks at all this stuff from a view of an educator and says like, hey, I'm going to challenge you on some of this stuff because we want the challenges before the book is published, not after. Right. So we want like, hey, did you think about this? And sometimes the author's like, that's what I want. And they're like, hey, it's your book if that's what you're trying to go for. But we want that kind of pushback before. So it wasn't just like we have someone writing a book, then an editor who's never worked in education, who doesn't really think about this. So we kind of have both those eyes. And that's really, because we know how important that is. And I saw it firsthand, the benefits of it by working with you. And that was never the intent when we did Innovators Mindset. And you kind of helped me, but I was like, oh, this is way better. Yeah. So
Well, I think that we all can be better by that type of collaboration and being able to push.
yeah.
And thinking about schools and principals and all that work too. That's what great principals do, right? They create the conditions where they can give feedback. It's not the, oh my gosh, the principal's coming, I have to put on a dog and pony show. It's here's the principal who's giving me feedback, helping me be better, creating the conditions where I can work with my colleagues.
Mhm. Oh,
So let's dive in to what are the 5 key pillars that make a great principal?
this is being like, can people see the video when I do this? Like, is
Yeah.
this bad? Okay. Hey, everyone. All right. What are the 5 pillars by George Couros and Allyson Apsey? And by the way, 15 amazing contributors. Allyson always talks about this as like a principal conference because it's like you got your keynotes, you got your breakout sessions,
I
delivered by
like
different
it.
people. Yeah, so we did talk about these 5 pillars. The first one is relationship builder. The second one is continuous learner. Pillar 3 is talent cultivator. Pillar 4 is resource maximizer, which is actually like a lot of people don't talk about because it's kind of boring. But we had really amazing, right? I was like, oh, like, can we make this not boring? And they did such a good job because it's like nobody is like, who you need leaders, not managers. Like, nah, you kind of need both. So that's kind of what we can talk about that. And then the last one, and it was very intentional to list it last, was visionary. And part of that was the conversations that Alice and I had, you and I had. Why? Because a lot of people would actually think that's the first thing, and I would actually argue it's the last thing. Now, I don't think they're like it's a hey, you do this first, you do this second. They all kind of blend together. But in the book, we want to make sure it was last for a very purposeful reason.
Yeah, and you started off with relationship builder, which I love and appreciate.
Yep.
And um, you talk a lot about relationships and how key they are to the work we do in education. But you started off with lessons around leadership that you learned from your parents. I'd love for you to
Right.
share some of those examples.
Yeah. So that to me, really kind of making this like a really human centered organization. I know that's something you're very passionate, and that's probably why we connect so well, over the years. But like I talked about, every morning when kids came to the school and I was a principal, I was greeting them at the door, welcoming them, make sure and like checking in, kids that you knew struggle in classrooms. Like, can you like, hey, what's going on,
Mhm.
right? So you can kind of do your best to send them off to a classroom where they're smiling, they're a little bit more excited to be there than maybe if they weren't, or like, hey, something's going on here, giving that up. And that was something I learned from my mom. Worked at a restaurant for years. I watched her doing that. People would come in, she'd welcome you. She'd get to know about your family, and people just felt like we own a Greek family restaurant, right? So that was the thing. And then as a principal, I always went into classrooms every day, and you might not know this term, but I guarantee when I say the term, everyone will know what I'm talking about in education. I often talk about what I call the superintendent entourage. Where basically, so you like, even if you've never heard that term, you like, it's like the superintendent comes with a board, they like show up and they're wearing, whatever fancy clothes. And it's just the most awkward and everyone's not acting the same. But for me as a principal, I remember going into classrooms very early on and people getting really uptight because they're not used to seeing that. But then I went all the time where you didn't even notice me. And it was partly I wanted to make sure I was connecting, knew what was kind of going, not like, I think when I say knew what was going on, a lot of people are like, I'm watching you teachers. It's like, no, I want to know what's going on.
Right.
Is there like, what are the conditions like for classrooms? And kind of doing that connection. And I learned that from my dad, who'd cook in the back, come out, he'd check in on you, see how you're doing, kind of connecting there. So we really said how there's a kind of a through line in all the pillars with this. There was one thing, and I actually just kind of, I'm going to highlight this week. I talked about, we always talk about relationships in education and, our communities who we connect with. But I also said, like, there's also a really important relationship we don't pay attention to. It's the ones with ourselves and the ones with our people outside of our schools. Mm-hmm. And by the way, we're doing this. We live on 3 hour difference in time zones because I needed to go for a run this morning. And we're doing it so you can go to your bar class, because we know that if we're not actually taking care of ourselves personally, then we can't help anyone else. So that was a really important thing. I think people don't talk about that enough, is that, hey, there is a connection to what you're doing, because we often can give hey, listen, you have like physical evidence of this. I've been giving myself for years that I forgot to take care of myself until a point where I was, had terrible health and had to get that in check. So I think a lot of times, especially in education, like we are notoriously bad at taking care of ourselves until it's too late, or we have to kind of dig ourselves out of a hole that we've created. So it's not just like give everything to your schools, give everything to, and then, let's give our leftovers at home. So I think that was a really important aspect in the relationship piece that I don't think many books talk about when they talk about this idea of relationship building in education.
Yeah, what's the quote that, like, when the principal sneezes, everybody else gets sick? So if you are not doing well and you're not taking care of your own self, I mean, I think that's true in leadership, then everyone else feels it. And it's important. One of the things, as you were talking, I love the story about your parents and the connection to the restaurant. But a lot of times I hear when things aren't going well at a school, it's us versus them. It's like the teachers against the principal, right? The dark side, or they talk about like, they're making us do this. And if those aren't there, those relationships aren't there, that respect isn't there between the principal and the educators, how can we get anything else done?
And I think that there's sometimes, sometimes as a principal, as a teacher, you almost felt like you were being attacked by parents, right? Or families would be mad at you or something like that. And one of the things I always would say is like, when I kind of felt that was happening, I would start to say like, hey, you are here to do what's best for your child, correct? And I wouldn't say it as a statement, I'd say it as a question, because I need a yes out of you. So it's like, hey, let's recenter, because if you and I are working against each other, this is gonna be tough. But if you and I work together, we're doubling the chance of your child's success. That's kind of my belief system there. And the same is true with teachers. And, one of the things that I write about all the time, I actually just talked about this in a video, because we're kind of, talking about aspects of the book, is I actually I try to stay away from the term student. Like, we want our students to achieve success. We want our students to achieve their dreams. Of course we do, but then you eliminate the adults. So I use the term learners very intentionally, because it's like anybody willing to grow, we want you to see yourself in that vision. So that's the adults as well, because I think that's where the disconnect is. Like, in full disclosure, I've been guilty of like, hey, we always do what's best for the student. And sometimes I felt that maybe in the past, it was to the detriment of the adults. Whereas now you have to kind of get in that space of, hey, are you doing something that is hurtful to the adults, that's actually going to hurt the students, like because of the students, like you kind of got to figure that out. And I think there's some obviously complications there, but this
I
is
just want to call out, I mean, the fact that you're focusing on learners, very learner-centered, collaborative of
right,
you, being on this
right,
podcast.
right. Yeah. And I think that's like, so, and I think that's a really important aspect, is that we don't just use that term uh, and just assume we're talking students. It's like,
Right.
no, we're talking anybody willing to grow, right? So I think
Yeah.
that's an important aspect.
Well,
Um,
and I think I mean, as an aside, that's when people say interchangeably, oh, we're student-centered or we're learner-centered. I don't think those terms are interchangeable. I think it's a very different orientation. When you are learner centered, you are focusing on the
right?
system as a whole being learners, and really growing. And it's not just, hey, kids, you need to be this, and we're going to continue to do what we've always done as adults. It's all of us are learning so we can evolve in our practice and get to the goals we have.
Yeah, and that like even but seeing that as an administrator, there was a story I told about, and I feel a little bit bad saying this, but it is true. I had a principal when I was a teacher. He was the nicest guy ever, and he was at the end of his career, and he knew he was retiring. Right? We all knew he was retiring, and we were at like a teacher convention. It was the last session of the day, and about 10 minutes in, he just gets up and walks out, and I'm like, because he doesn't care. He's done. Like he's done. What are you gonna do? Fire the guy who's about to retire? So we sat there and like, oh, he's leaving. Like he's out. So we waited 2 minutes and we are like, we're leaving too. So we just left because we're like, there's no one to get us in trouble. And a lot of times, the people we serve see what we're doing and they mimic it. I am like really big on, I don't care what you say, I care what you do and what I see. And that's why, hey, we want, like, one of the things I talked about in the book is I'm not a big fan of like learning norms in schools. I don't like it. I find it's a little bit condescending in some sense, and it's all in the delivery. But all I say is learn in a way you'd expect from your students. That's what I expect of the adults.
Mm-hmm.
And can we live up to that? Can we do those things? And I think that to me is a really important aspect, because it's like, what are we asking for, and how are we modeling that? And I think
Yeah.
those two are really, really important.
Well, and I think so this is, pillar two is continuous learner. And this is an important piece. And your story about the principal, yes, he was at the end of his career, but frankly, I see that happen a lot, right? That, okay, can you come and do this PD for my teachers? And then, but I don't need to be there, or we're going to come
Right.
together and talk about this work. And then the principal's in the back on the computer. And when I see that at conferences or in different places, I'm thinking it's really hard for a teacher to feel like this really matters and I should be fully invested in this when my principal is not investing in the work. And we see that play down to the learners in the classroom. If we aren't modeling those practices and learning ourselves, how in the world can we just keep telling somebody else to do something that we are not willing to do ourselves?
Yeah, I've done enough events in my life where politicians will come in, someone from the state, from, federal government, whatever, and they're like, "Oh, we really want to learn and get better from you." And they say their piece, and then the second the learning starts, they're out. They're off to their next thing to like say something. And it's like, are you really interested in learning, or are you just saying the things? And like, I don't like, that's why a lot of people don't like politicians, to be honest with you. And so that part of it too is like, if you're gonna make these decisions,
Hmm.
that impact classrooms, that impact teachers, that impact students, I need you to kind of be around us, right? Like that is a really important aspect. And so I think that when you talk about that with leadership, that's why there's a lot of, that's why there's some, well, I shouldn't say some, there's a lot of disconnect,
Right.
because it's like, you don't understand us, because the second we're actually asked to do something, you bolt, and you don't really understand the implications of what you're asking, because you're not there to be a part of it.
Right.
Right. And like, even one of the things I've talked about for years is like, I used to just take my laptop and sit in teachers' classrooms and do email and whatever. And I used to say, I'm not observing you, I'm observing the environment we're putting you in, so I can like make sure that you have what you need. And I just want to be here to kind of be in that space. And so, maybe, you know, in the 80s, there was a reason you had to be in your office, but there's not really now. Like you have
Yeah.
devices that you can be in those spaces, because I'm also trying to learn about the community. I'm trying to learn about the school. I'm trying to learn about the resources you have access to, and kind of talking about that. So I think just being a continuous learner is so imperative, because you're always asking your staff to grow. You're always asking your kids to grow. But if they don't see it, and there's a huge difference between the idea of doing it and people seeing you do
Right.
it, and that's something I think is really important.
Yeah, I think I love this quote that from the book. You said, "We talk about leading by example in education, but learning by example comes first." And I think that really highlights what you just said.
Totally. And even, you know, it's funny because people are like, oh, like, how do you find time to blog? I was like, you know, as a principal, I blogged all the time. Like I actually blogged, I actually think 10 times a week,
A
which
lot.
is a lot, which is a lot. I try to do like, you know, at least once or twice a week, where I write something or, you know, in different spaces. But I felt there's just way more material I had to write about, because I saw kids all the time, is a very different role. But I also wanted, but it wasn't like, this is how it is and this is how things should be. Is like, hey, I'm really struggling with awards. And here's why. Here's some of the stuff I've been reading.
Mhm.
What do you think? And actually using that and connecting that way. And I remember like we got rid of awards in our school when I was principal. And it was interesting because if you had asked me 2 years prior, would you be the principal who would get rid of awards? I'd be like, hey, no, I don't. We don't have fluffy schools. That's not what we do, right? And then once you started, like, I started looking at Dan Pink, Alfie Cohn, Joe Bauer, who passed away, very close friend of mine. A lot of the research showed that basically when you actually focus on awards, you take your focus away from learning. And so people are just saying, okay, what are the boxes that I need to check to get this award? But they weren't actually thinking deeply about anything. There's no innovation, there's no creativity, because it's just like, tell me the box, let me check the box. I'll be the best box checker.
Right.
So, and like kind of just going through that journey and learning that out loud and people reading that, when we got to the point where we said, you know what, this isn't really good for our community, there was no pushback, because my community was learning alongside of me through that process. But if I just kind of read books, in private, nobody knew, and then I said, hey, guess what? We're getting rid of awards, that would have never flown, because it's like, what are you talking about? So like a lot of people think it was because we had lower expectations we got rid of it. It was actually the opposite. It was like, no, we actually want our kids to be way more creative. We want them to be way more innovative. And so this is actually detrimental to that. Right. So it was in a lowered expectation. My whole thing is about getting kids to higher expectations. That's really how you get them out of tough situations.
Yeah, and widening that aperture, right? Instead of just one way to be successful.
Yeah.
We can have a whole nother podcast on that one. But one of the things that, you highlighted is you want everyone to be successful, everyone to be more creative and innovative. And that kind of ties into the third pillar of a talent cultivator,
Right.
right? So you build relationships, talking about being a continuous learner and modeling the learning we want to see in our schools and communities. But then we also have to really help people get to that next level and be their best. So I think this is one of your incredible strengths is really pushing people and like we talked about, seeing their work, pushing them, helping to maximize each person's potential. You'll often talk about it as getting from their point A to their point B.
Yeah.
So I thought it was an interesting way that you framed it in the book around what you would do as a new principal. So talk about your approach. If you were given a new school tomorrow, what
Yeah.
might be your approach to cultivating talent?
Yeah. And so Allyson talked about this quite a bit, because when it was interesting, because she read it from me and she's like, I'm using that forever. And this was years before even the book came together. So innovation, a lot of it's connected to, changing, really kind of improving. So this is something I'm really known for, is really kind of, pushing schools to a different level, really rethinking practices. And so I am always known as the change guy, right? Oh, like, hey, we need people to embrace change. Let's bring in George. And when I'm asked, like, hey, if you were ever to start a new school, what's the first thing you do? And my answer is always the same: nothing. I would not change anything. I would get to understand who the people are, what their strengths are, and I'd make sure not only do I know those things, they know I know those things. Because when you go into a new community, as not only a principal, administrator, whoever, if you go in and people feel that you're coming there to fix them and that they're way better because you're there all of a sudden, that's where you get so much of this turmoil. But if people know they're valued and like really feel being valued, and then they know you're trying to get them to a next level because you see that potential in them, then they're going to be with you the whole way, right? And I'll give you a story I've never shared publicly, right? This is like I've always been really focused on this. I was like, why is this such a big thing for me? I remember I dated this girl when I was like in grade 9. It was like my first girlfriend ever. And
I can't wait to see where this goes.
this is awesome. And so she said to me, I wore white pants, right? I don't know why I wore white pants. I bought a pair of white pants. And she's like, you look really good in white pants. I'm like, oh, thanks. You know what I did? I bought like 10 pairs of white pants after. Because like if you compliment me on something, I'm gonna double down on that, right? And so I know that's like a weird analogy. It's the white pants analogy. It is the notion that sometimes when we recognize what someone is really good at, they double down on, and then and so there is so much research that basically says when you focus on strengths, not only do those strengths increase, but the weaknesses actually get better as well. And in Innovator's Mindset, I talked about this. There is an article that shared basically it's like literacy scores go up in Ontario, Canada, and then math scores go down. So in the entire article, they mentioned literacy 0 times. They suck at math, we suck at math, we suck at math, blah, blah, blah. And then what happens? The superintendents of the school districts, hey, we suck at math. What do the principals say? We suck at math. Then the teachers, we suck at math, right? And so it's just focus on this. And then it's like, why are people like so upset? Why are they? Well, because you keep telling them they suck at everything, right? And my argument in Innovator's Mindset was the first thing we should have said there is, why are we so good at literacy? What are we doing there that makes us so good? And what are those things that we can maybe learn from that maybe apply to math, apply to how we're teaching math? And that's the focus, is that it's educational whack-a-mole. We suck at this thing, so let's focus on that, and then guess what? You're going to suck at something later, and then because you're focusing all yours in this. And so I always kind of think about that. It's really about doubling down on your strengths to not only improve your strengths, but actually to build your weaknesses as well.
Well, I love that, and that we all have different strengths.
The white pants story, you like that story?
Great. Yes, you tied it in beautifully. But we all have different strengths. We don't all look good in white pants, So we all have to.
I did it in grade 9, so there you go. I've never bought a pair of white pants since. Just so you know, I bought those 10 pairs, and she got me right after. But
maybe you didn't look as good as you thought you did in the white pants.
I don't know.
So back to cultivating talent. I think the strengths-based piece, it's a huge belief of mine, and I've seen it time and time again. And we are so bad in education. I often start workshops with people asking them to think about their strengths, successes they've had, and everyone's like, awkward, I don't know what I'm going to say. How do I just like push this off? And I make people do it because it is so important to recognize our strengths as the adults, because we need to cultivate that in young people. And when we don't think about our strengths and we're constantly focused on, you're not good here, you're not good there, we're collectively not doing well, it just creates an environment where everyone's not good enough and they don't want to do better. And, going back to, you talked about the awards, right? The same thing with like grades and test scores, and we can go off on a totally different tangent, but when we're always focusing on what we're not doing well, we're not helping people figure out what they do well and how to grow that, so that we can have better test scores and we can do better in our grades. But by focusing on those things, I wholeheartedly believe we're not going to get there. We have to focus on the broader goals.
Yeah, and we've had this conversation a ton, both publicly and privately. The thing that I really struggle with in education, and I think this is, I think really good intentions, really good, purposeful thought is like, I do not, I know this is like, people are going to hate that I say this. I don't think every kid can be good at math. I really don't think that. And honestly, I just think there's no way you're ever going to get me good at science. And it's because I don't want to be good at science. I don't really care. And that's okay, because I also know science is important and someone would be way better suited to that. So part of but I don't think every kid should be good at every single thing. Like, we always talk about personalizing learning, but then we try to standardize what we expect. And so really, I don't want every kid to be good at the same thing. I want every kid to walk out of school being good at something, and really kind of understanding that too. And so we have to be comfortable saying, hey, we have kids who are not going to be good at this, but they're really great at this. Or we have this kid's going to be bad at this, and that's okay because they're great at this. And if it doesn't fit within the spectrum of what we deem as important in education, that's where part of the problem is like, well, kids have to be good in these spaces. And, like, I've had a lot of conversations about this. Like, we still have this mentality that college is the only way. And in so many places, education, or, we don't say it, but we kind of hint at it and we share this. And I think that to me is a really important aspect. Is I don't think you should stop teaching math, but the idea that, hey, every kid has to be good at this or we have failed. Nah, every kid has to be good at something, and help them figure that out. Right. Even when I was a principal, I had a kid who was like amazingly manipulative and could like get under adult skin and like would find what your flaw is and go at it, and just could make teachers cry. It was amazing. Like, it was just amazing. And my goal with that,
just to be clear, not amazing that he's making teachers cry.
No, wow, it's amazing skill. It was horrible he's doing it. And so my goal is like, hey, this kid actually has something that's really a gift. And what we got to teach this kid is he can read people. He's very good. He understands that. How do we get them to use this for good instead of evil? Because he's using this for evil right now. And what people would tend to do is like not see that. I know it sounds weird. Like, yeah, I don't want any kid talking poorly to anybody. That was not the focus. I'm saying this kid is really skilled. It's just they're using it in a really, really bad way. And so can we get them to kind of understand that? And hey, do you know partly why I saw that? Because I was the kid. I was the exact same kid. I could get under your skin and I knew how to do that. And, I was blessed to be able to, do what I do today, because it's like, hey, like, how do you use this to really kind of help
get under people's skin?
Get under people's skin, but in a good way, to make them
sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes.
So I think what you're referring to reminds me of Todd Rose's jagged profile, right? That not everybody has to be the same in all subjects and be at this level, but we want to recognize and honor the jagged profile. We still want to build up foundational skills. Want to be clear, like, kids need to learn how to read. They need to be able to be Absolutely. Fluent in the basics. And I know that's not what we're saying, but like being an expert mathematician is different than like having the foundational skills to be able to excel in the past that really build on your own strengths.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a little controversial take here. Okay. So I don't know if this is like a TikTok camera moment or what we do here. Here's the we kind of guilt kids like, oh, we don't believe every kid is college. I cannot stand when people refer to kids in school as scholars. It bothers me to such a degree, because let's be honest. Would you call a plumber a scholar? Like, no. Would you?
You're not going to get pushback from me on that
one. But I don't think anyone would be here. But then it kind of makes like you are less than and I'll tell you, if a plumber comes into my house, they are immediately the smartest person in the house, because like, I don't know. And it doesn't matter how degrees I have. I call them because I don't know what to do. And they have an intelligence that I don't actually have. So it's like little things like that, because scholars typically tied to academics. Academics is typically tied to college, to, university, all of these things. So it's like the intent is, I understand the intent. It's like,
I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, I understand the intent.
It's high expectations, right? The intent is high expectations, but the word we use has a narrow view of what that success is.
Totally. So it's like, it's got to be this way. Whereas, I never, English teachers get really mad at me for saying I don't like reading novels. Oh, you miss out and blah, blah, blah. I'm like, did you play sports? And they're like, well, no. I said, well, you missed out there. So, sports have taught me so many things that, brought out leadership capabilities, the ability to work with other people, to collaborate, to work on a goal that I don't know if I would have got the same thing from reading novels. Whereas you could give me all of the things that would benefited you from reading novels. And I understand that. So I don't think less of a person because they didn't play high school basketball, that you should think less of me because I didn't read, the Great Gatsby inside out. So I think that's a really important aspect.
I agree. So
I
building
mean, I
on
agree. That's
strengths,
why we're such good friends.
I know. Building on like the talent cultivator piece,
Right.
I think this next pillar is an interesting one. You mentioned at the beginning that it's the least sexy, right? It's like not as fun, the resource maximizer.
Right.
But as I've grown in my own leadership, I recognize that it's so critical.
Right.
And I love that you highlight Stephen Covey's leadership, his quote, leadership is about people, management is about things. And for me, this ties back to the strengths-based piece. Like some people are really good at managing things. They're very detail-oriented,
Right.
process-oriented, very good at managing the things. And some people are more skilled maybe in the people and dealing with that. But it's an important aspect for the principal or a leader to not ignore. So talk a little bit about like we get this wrong a lot. So how do we really become the resource maximizer?
Like it's one of the education cliches, and maybe it's a organizational cliche. Is like we don't need managers, we need leaders. Like you actually need both, right? So the idea of that, you can have this incredible vision of where you're trying to take people, where you're trying to go, but then it's like, hey, like we want to do all these things, but we actually need some money. Oh, I didn't budget for that, right? And that's part of it too. Is do you have a vision? Do you actually put things in place to help bring that vision to fruition, right? And kind of thinking about that process. But here's I was thinking about this as you were sharing this. I think there's this notion that we need to be all things to all people. Like, and the reason I say this is when I became a principal, the first person I hired it was my very first hire, and easily my best hire, was my assistant principal. And the interesting thing about this is my assistant principal was a teacher on my staff when I was the assistant principal, and her and I got in a fight literally within 2 minutes of meeting each other. And I was like, I do not like this person, and it was not good. And I remember looking at my principal, I'm like, what? And he's like, she's good, just trust me. Like, it's probably a little bit you right now, right? So she would push back on me super hard, and I was new to the job, so I'm like, I'm the boss, right? Like you should be listening to me. So she would always challenge me, and then I got to know her better, and it wasn't that she stopped challenging me, it was I understood why she was challenging me. And I understand her intentions. She wanted the same thing I did. She wanted to do what was best for our students and to best for the people in our school, but she had a little different viewpoint on it, on how we got there. And so we would have those really tough conversations. And when I became principal, I'm like, that's who I want as my assistant principal, because she sees things I don't see.
Right.
And so coming back to the resource maximizer, and this is like, you'll understand this. The editing process doesn't work in my brain. It's just, I get bleary eyed. I kind of lose focus.
That's how I feel with spreadsheets.
Right,
I just don't get it.
So she could do things that I couldn't do. And it was, I don't know what they're like in Canada. I think they were IPPs. I can't remember. It was like IEPs. So she did all that stuff. That is a very detailed oriented process. And so it was like, okay, here's some of the things that I do. And I remember I was going to talk to her to do it. And she said to me, hey, like, do you want me to do all like the inclusive education stuff with IPP? I'm like, yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Like I was going to do it, but I never was. That was going to be like an assigned duty as a principal, but and it just worked. And the interesting thing is my principal, when I was assistant principal, that's what he did. And so we actually, there's a lot of times like, oh, the principal does these things, the assistant principal does these things. And so, the assistant principal in many schools does the discipline, does this. So I did the discipline when I was assistant principal. When I became principal, guess what? I did the discipline because that's what I was really good at and what I was really comfortable with, because I knew how to deal with kids who struggle because I was a bad kid. And so I was like, oh, I've been there. So I think part of it too is it is ensuring that maybe, hey, you're not as good with some of the management stuff and some of the details and some of the budgeting things. So then you better make sure that's taken care of, because the argument I always have when I became a principal, I didn't need another George. I already had George. I was good. And I was just on a podcast the other day. Do you know what I can do better than everybody in the entire world? I am like 100% this. No, but thanks though. What I can do better than everybody in the world is be George. Nobody can be George Couros as good as I could be George Couros. So I don't need you to try to be me. I needed someone who was different, someone that people appeal to in a different way. And, would actually, some people would say like, I feel way more comfortable talking to Cheryl than George. So, hey, right?
Yeah, I think that so the talent cultivator and the resource maximizer really go together. Is one, you have to know what talents exist. But I think the point here, like, you can't ignore, if you are this visionary leader or building great relationships, you can't ignore the budget. You can't have this great new initiative around, changing how students learn without giving teachers time to collaborate, without being clear about what comes off the plate, without working through and being in the classrooms and understanding the context. And so those things have to go together, but figuring out who you also have on your staff and in your team to help you with details or things that you might not be great at, or there might be a leader who's fantastic at the details and need people to, work with the staff and help lead professional learning. But I know that I would not survive without Joanna and Brianna on our team, who are so good at seeing things that I don't see, and spreadsheets.
Totally. Yeah. And like, one of the things you said that I think is really important is, time allocation. I was really big, and you mentioned Covey. I was really big into Leader in Me as a principal. I was huge. I loved the book. I saw the programs. I'm like, this is awesome. This is like perfect for our school. So we looked at getting that program for our school. And I remember taking a team, we visited another school. So it wasn't just me. It was like some of our staff, and we had like this 5-hour drive. And I remember saying to them, what did you think? And they're like, oh, it was really good. I'm like, no. What did you actually think? And they're like, well, and then we had some like tough conversations. And then it was like basically based on their feedback. I'm like, I see the merits of the idea behind this, but I don't think that our staff is ready for this in the way that it's going to be delivered, nor do I want to put a bunch of money into it when I don't think we're ready to it. So actually I think that's a really important aspect. I never brought my staff or asked for their feedback when I wasn't open to doing something with their feedback. And that was really important to me, is like, if I'm asking you, then I'm open to changing my mind on this as well. But I used to say this too, and I don't know if you're going to like this, but I think it's a fair thing to say. I don't like my time being wasted, and I try to.
Anyone does.
Well, and that's why I think so I'm making an assumption. Nobody likes their time being wasted. So I would tell my staff, hey, here's this thing that's going to be happening in our school. I have no say. This is being directed. So nothing you say is going to change this. So I'm going to tell you that now. We can talk about it, but I'm telling you, at the end of the day, nothing will be changed about it. So I never would ask for feedback on things that could not be changed. And so we had very few conversations based on some of those initiatives. It's like, this is kind of just the sucky part of some of the stuff we have to do, but it is what it is. And he didn't pretend that he could do something. And, people would say to me, thanks for like wasting our time on this. You know what I mean? And that's a resource maximizer move, is like, hey, I only got a certain amount of time. Do I want to have my people voicing their opinions on something I have no say over changing.
Right. And getting spun up.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Because I have to get to bar and take care
Right.
of
You gotta take care of yourself because that's very important.
I want it. The last pillar is visionary, and you talked a little bit about why you left it for last.
Yeah.
And when we, we're going back and forth on this, on the vision.
Yeah.
One of the things you said, like, it has to be the community's vision, and I do love that and respect that, right? So talk a little bit about the decision and what that means for it to be a community vision in your mind.
Yeah. Well, I think it's not like you go into a school and you have no hopes or aspirations of what you can achieve, right? So I don't think it's just like pretending like, oh, 100% is what they want. I have no say. There is some influence that you have to kind of go through there. Like, hey, can we get to this spot? Can we do this too? But you have to kind of understand where you're at. And maybe you do have a vision of where you want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe they're way ahead of you, to be honest with you. And maybe they're behind you. And I think sometimes like schools, actually not sometimes, I think schools become the personalities of their principal so often. You can see kind of like this whole notion of like, hey, we build a culture, and then if someone new comes in, no, they're still my boss, and if they don't want this, then I might change what I'm doing. So I think it's partly, it kind of ties into all of these pillars. Who are the people I'm serving? What would best serve them? What do we actually have access to? Mm-hmm. Right? So there, that notion of resource maximizer, like what, kind of going back to this notion of talent cultivator, right? So what are the gifts that we have in this school already that we can utilize, and kind of coming back and looking at all of those things, and how do we continuously grow? Like, how do we get to that space? So really kind of building that vision as a community makes it way more likely to achieve, as opposed to, hey, I have a vision for where I want this school to be. I don't know you. I don't know anything about you, but this is where we're going. That's where you get that pushback. That's where you get that challenge. And so, like, you can have a vision, but people don't want to be a part of it. And they're less likely to want to be a part of it if it's made for them. And it's kind of making an assumption like you're the only smart person there. Do you know what I mean? When you have the vision, it's like, well, I know better than everybody. I was like, good luck with that. Good luck with getting people on board with, I'm smarter than everybody. So
I will never forget this new leader. Mm-hmm. That I was, in my kid's school.
Yeah.
And he was new to the position and had all of these forums, and everything was my vision. This is my vision. Just repeatedly, like webinar style, my vision. And I thought, it is so hard to get on board with that. I don't feel part of this at all. I don't feel included. I feel like I'm just being told and drug along. And it was really sad to me, and it just can be done so much better. Like you said, you can and should have an opinion about what you want to do and where you're going and how to best meet the needs of the learners in your space. But if it isn't cultivated from the community that you're with, it's really hard to make it happen.
It's interesting when you say that, because even if you agreed with it,
I totally agreed with it.
Right?
I just didn't like how it was presented.
Yeah, like, I don't like. Yeah, whatever. It's kind of, there is that process of ownership. That's what I haven't mentioned this. I think it's really important. I didn't write this book because I was such a good principal and I want everyone to learn from this. I wrote this book. The idea came because I had an amazing principal. Her name was Kelly Wilkins, and she inspired this. And like, when I looked at her practices, and one of the things that I can say she did better than anyone I've ever encountered was she helped me feel such an ownership over the entirety of the school as a teacher that it made me want to be better for not only the students I worked with, but my colleagues and for the community. And I never felt that before her. And that was really important to me. And, there is an ownership I feel that's kind of really connected when you're a principal. Like, it's, this is like, if something goes wrong, I always make this joke, right? Like, the assistant principal, I love being assistant principal. Why? Because I have a lot of authority to get things done. But if anything goes wrong, everyone blames the principal, right? Mm-hmm. There's so much ownership on the principal's shoulders. So when things go wrong, then, I remember my superintendent saying to me, like, if stuff goes wrong, George, just so you know, you're getting the call. right? Like if something's wrong in a teacher's report card, it's actually the responsibility of the principal. I remember that those very clear things. And so there's a certain ownership that just kind of like dumped on your shoulders, whether you want it or not. The goal for me as a principal was, how do I actually get people to not just feel, but truly understand that they have an ownership over the entirety of our school. And that's what Kelly did so well. I didn't want to just do well in my class. I wanted all of my colleagues in my school to do better because of Kelly's leadership. So that's and I think that's a really important aspect. I don't want anyone thinking that, I'm sure I had great stuff that I did. There's stuff that even as writing this book, I'm like, oh, like I wish I would have done that.
Yeah.
But,
Well,
so
and
it was really physicality. Yeah.
that's a beautiful piece, is having people to look up to who model, what you want to be, building on who you are as a person. And I think that's the great part about this book is, you have your stories. We have great examples and research from Allyson and her work. And then, we have students. I love seeing Taylor Teeman in there,
Right.
new teachers, all the way to other principals and leaders. So there's great stories. Thank you for writing this book.
Yeah.
Thanks for including me in the process. I'm excited to see how other people's stories evolve because of the ones you've shared in the book.
Yeah, and that's always the hope of the book, of the books I write. I don't ever think I'm smart enough to tell people what to do. I'm just not that person. My hope is always that people kind of get some ideas, but then they create their own solutions, that because they know their community better than I do. And I can tell you that because they live there or they're part of that school community. So it's really, my philosophy is, how do you help people find success in a pathway that is meaningful to them? And that's the hope through this, is not, hey, we've just decided if you do these 5 things, you'll be a great principal. It's like, nah, look at these 5 things. What does this mean to you? What does this look like to your community? How do you bring that to fruition?
Sounds good. Thanks for being here, George. Always appreciate the
Thanks, everyone.
conversation.